She turned the key quietly, as if silence could erase the night she wanted to forget. The hallway bulb hummed awake, its tired glow washing over a shoe out of place, a cup overturned, a coat on the floor like a shed skin. Her heart counted the wrongs faster than her eyes could catalogue them. The light, once a neutral witness, suddenly felt like an interrogator. Beyond the living room, her bedroom door stood ajar, a thin seam of darkness cleaved by a brighter, bluer pulse, her laptop screen alive without permission. In that glow, a truth waited, patient as a knife in a drawer, promising to make a cut she could never unfeel. All evening she had rehearsed a gentler version of herself, the forgiving nurse who had just finished a double shift and wandered into a mistake. Leila knew the story she would tell if she ever had to, the softened angles of a night unplanned, a stranger's warmth filling a silence that had grown too loud at home. She told herself she had not been hunting for betrayal. She had been trying to quiet the loneliness that had become the only consistent sound in her apartment. Loneliness punctuated by a boyfriend whose apologies had dulled like coins rubbed smooth by constant handling. The city had been relentless that week. At the clinic, Leila clocked her hours and carried pain up and down fluorescent hallways like boxes no one else could lift. Her patients trusted the gravity in her voice and the steadiness in her hands. Outside, the neighborhood shifted under the pressure of new coffee bars and wide strollers, while the old bodega still buzzed with an old television and the unhurried patience of a shopkeeper who had learned to survive every kind of storm. Gentrification was a slow betrayal, and Leila kept a running ledger of its small injuries, a mural painted over in tasteful beige, a neighbor priced out of her own childhood street, a police cruiser idling with the impunity of a guest who never intended to leave. Jordan had become a part of that ledger without meaning to. He worked in tech, carried his ideals like badges, and posted solidarity statements with the cadence of someone who believed typing could be a form of touch. But his empathy wore thin when it brushed against Leila's reality. Whenever she talked about the way security guards shadowed her at the pharmacy, or how an attending physician took credit for her idea and thanked her as if she were a volunteer, Jordan's face would settle into that diplomatic expression he used at work, the kind that tried to turn facts into misunderstandings and bruises into teachable moments. Trust had once been a smooth road between them. Then, increment by increment, it developed hairline cracks. A text that arrived at midnight and was turned face down. A weekend trip cancelled with a vague explanation and a crisp new excuse. A friend of his who referred to Leila as articulate, and expected gratitude for discovering something obvious. None of it was enough to shatter anything, but it was enough to make every step careful. On the night she strayed, Leila had finished charting after the lights were lowered, her name still pinned to her scrubs like a confession. A stranger at the bar noticed her exhaustion and reflected it back to her with the soft focus of flattery. It was not romance, it was anesthesia. When she walked home in the diluted hours before dawn, she felt like a person stepping off a train onto the wrong platform, too tired to retrace her route, too ashamed to ask for directions. She reached her building with the weary stealth of someone rehearsing apologies she would never deliver. The hallway smelled like laundry detergent and old dust. The lock hesitated the way it always did, as though the door wanted to confirm her identity. When the light came on, she saw the disorder that did not belong to fatigue or chance. In that instant, she understood that her small betrayal was only a footnote inside a larger story already written without her consent. She walked through the living room as if the floor had switched to ice. Every detail announced itself with the cruel enthusiasm of a child tattling. The sneaker near the sofa was not hers and not Jordan's. It was the brand she had teased him about, the kind he said he would never wear. A vase on the shelf was rotated slightly, revealing a crescent of dust where it had sat undisturbed for months. The coat on the floor smelled faintly like cologne cut with mint, not the scent she knew from Jordan's closet, but the one he sometimes borrowed from his colleague after the gym. Her laptop's glow held steady, the webcam's pinprick light unblinking. On the trackpad, a faint smear suggested a finger that wasn't hers. An open folder showed file names she did not recognize, spreadsheets with her name, time-stamped as if she had been home compiling them. There were emails drafted in her account, unsent but neatly addressed, each with subject lines that made her chest tighten, schedule changes, medication inventory requests, a reprimand she had allegedly composed to a junior nurse. It was all too tidy, as if someone had tried to simulate her life with the precision of a thief who wore gloves and left fingerprints on purpose. In the bedroom, the bedspread was smoothed too carefully, as if the act of making it had been performed by someone waiting to be caught. On the nightstand, a small black rectangle lay like a forgotten confession, a key fob for a security company she did not use. When she pressed it, no light blinked. It was either dead or a decoy. Either way, it belonged to a plan that did not include her consent. Her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter with a message from the building manager about a noise complaint from the night before, a complaint that claimed she had hosted a loud gathering and refused to quiet down. The manager's wording was rehearsed politeness edged with warning. Leila recognized the pattern. People like her were often invited to justify their presence in their own homes, a ritual that required performance and proof. She thought of the new neighbor who had once asked which unit she cleaned. She thought of the officer who had told her to calm down after hearing she had been followed on the train. Betrayal arrived in multiple shapes that morning. Jordan's absence was one. The staged mess was another. But a deeper treachery had been building, the kind that uses the world's biases like scaffolding. Whoever had been here knew her schedule, her passwords, the lint-trap ticks of her daily routines. Whoever had been here expected that if questions were asked, they would not be asked of the right people. The police, if called, would want a tidy story. The landlord would want a quiet tenant. The system would want to believe paperwork over pulse. She gathered evidence the way her job had taught her to gather vitals, precise, methodical, calm despite the noise inside. Photos of the shoe, the coat, the laptop screen with her name floating over a spreadsheet she had never opened. A video of the key fob resting on her palm, her voice steady as she narrated the date and time. In the mirror, she saw a face that belonged to someone accused of being too much, too loud, too sure. She steadied her breath and turned back to the central question: what story had been planted here, and who was meant to believe it? The knock arrived with the efficient inevitability of a plot point. When Leila opened the door, 2 officers stood with the posture of people expecting compliance. Behind them, the building manager hovered with folded arms and a mouth prepared to say, "This is for your safety." The officers announced a report: possible fraud related to controlled substances at the clinic, suspicious activity from her apartment's IP address, a tip about reselling medication, a noise complaint suggesting gatherings late at night. The summary sounded practiced, almost compassionate, as if the story came pre-lubricated with reasonable doubt. Reasonable, that is, to anyone who needed a reason to doubt her. Leila led them through the rooms without resistance, her movements composed, her hands visible, her voice trained to the speed of measured truth. She narrated each detail she had documented, naming discrepancies the way a pathologist names causes of death. She identified the shoe's size that did not match anyone in the apartment. She explained the key fob that connected to a company neither she nor the building used. She displayed the drafted emails and the recent logins she had already photographed, noting the atypical timestamps that overlapped with the hours she was recorded on shift. She pulled out her clinic badge, the one that tracked entry and exit and would, if anyone cared to check, prove she had not been home when the documents were opened. The officers listened with faces that promised nothing. One of them asked about Jordan. The way his name dropped into the room felt less like curiosity and more like choreography. Leila felt a cold understanding sneak into place. Jordan had keys. Jordan had colleagues. Jordan had the brand of cologne that wasn't his. Jordan had the right color of innocence for people who read ethics as aesthetics. She recalled the cancelled trip, the late texts, the hush around his phone when certain names lit up. She remembered the startup he had joined, the one that sold security as a subscription, the one that had bragged about partnerships with neighborhood watch programs dressed in tech jargon. She saw how this could work: a borrowed fob, a practiced entry, a staged digital trail, a tip placed from a number no one would trace. When the officers asked for her devices, she complied, placing her phone and laptop on the table as if laying down instruments after a procedure. She asked to add a note to their report: the existence of bias in the chain of suspicion, the pattern of weaponized assumptions that would color every comma in their paperwork. She told them she would not be calling a lawyer yet, but that she would be calling her supervisor and asking for access to entry logs, camera footage, and network activity from the clinic. She kept her voice level, avoiding any inflection that could be misread as threat. Rage, she knew, was a luxury granted selectively. As the officers conferred in the hallway, Leila's phone buzzed with an automated notification from her bank, an authorization request on a new account she had not opened, in a neighborhood where Jordan's office sat behind smoked glass. The betrayal crystallized into something beyond infidelity. She was being drafted into a narrative in which she was pre-labeled as the problem. The climax did not arrive with shouting or handcuffs. It arrived with an almost comical quiet, the thin click of a notification confirming that the ground beneath her had been traded for a trapdoor, and the realization that she would have to climb back up with the careful patience of a person who has learned to narrate her own rescue, sentence by sentence. The aftermath unfolded in the slow grammar of systems. At the clinic, Leila met with her supervisor, who studied logs with an attention sharpened by liability. The entries told a story in timestamps, Leila swiping into the medication room at precise intervals during her shift, a remote login to her apartment computer while she was recorded on a hallway camera rounding on patients, a series of access attempts that failed with her old password before succeeding with a new one she had never chosen. A nurse's work, Leila knew, leaves a trail of care. A saboteur's work leaves a trail of invention. She filed reports that sounded like diagnoses. She wrote a timeline that read like a case study. She pointed to patterns that would have been invisible if not for the centuries that trained her eyes to see them. The way suspicion pours fastest toward people like her. The way convenience and color conspire to make a theory feel true. The way silence is requested from those asked to justify their existence while noise is forgiven in those born inside an exonerating echo. Jordan remained mostly silent. His texts arrived with the bland softness of PR emails, the kind that leak sincerity without leaving fingerprints. He offered sympathy for the stress she was under and suggested breaks she could take. He recommended a lawyer he said was excellent. He urged patience, compliance, calm. In the absence of confession, Leila built her case from physics. She collected building entry logs showing a key used at 3:11 a.m. while she was documented at the clinic. She requested city camera footage from the corner that faced the lobby, and even if the angle refused to show a face, it showed a silhouette in a jacket that matched one she had seen in his closet, the kind with a stitched seam on the left shoulder that her fingers had once traced without knowing she was memorizing an alibi. The landlord, faced with documentation and the possibility of a tenant who knew how to make records into narrative, softened his tone. The building manager forwarded security emails with timestamps that bloomed like revelations. A neighbor on the second floor remembered footsteps the night of the alleged party and admitted, reluctantly, that the noise had sounded like a single pair of shoes moving from room to room, not a crowd. The officers returned for follow-up, their faces adjusted to the pallor of caution, and requested copies of everything. Leila provided it all carefully, with cover letters that read as if written by someone grading their professionalism. When a detective finally called, unscripted and curious, Leila felt the first hint of the ground returning. The call was not a miracle. It was the product of work, of logs, of insistence, of the measured repetition of "I belong here." It led to questions that rippled out into Jordan's office, where a security consultant recognized the fob, where a receptionist remembered a request to borrow it for testing, where a swipe on the building's service elevator was found at the same minute her apartment door had registered an entry. The story began to turn, not because the truth had changed, but because enough people had finally adjusted the angle of their gaze. Leila did not rejoice. Relief arrived as a colder sibling to vindication. The case would not lead to dramatic headlines, only to a soft correction that might never be printed. The clinic closed its review with a carefully neutral letter. The landlord issued an apology framed as clarification. The officers filed an amended report. Jordan resigned before any formal accusation, citing a need to focus on his mental health. His future would contain new doors that opened for him. Leila knew this and understood it as part of the quiet arithmetic of the world. She packed his remaining things with the tenderness of someone folding a flag they did not pledge to. She changed her passwords and added locks that respected her boundaries. She replaced the hallway bulb with a brighter one and left it on, not as a ward against fear, but as a reminder that illumination is a habit, not a mood. She tended to her patients with the same steadiness, but with an added sentence in her inner monologue, a line that said, "You have survived systems built without you." She left the bar where the mistake had begun and walked home with a new ritual. She narrated the city as if it were a body she was keeping alive, noting pulse points, listening for labored breaths, asking where it hurt most. The betrayal had not been singular. It had been layered: the lapse she owned, the conspiracy she resisted, the social weather that made one easier to commit and the other easier to believe. She did not absolve herself. She also did not permit the world to turn her error into an origin story for every suspicion someone wanted to project onto her. She learned that accountability without context becomes a weapon, and context without accountability becomes an excuse. She refused both distortions and chose the harder balance. In the months that followed, Leila began speaking at community meetings about digital safety and tenant rights. She translated the bureaucracy into steps people could climb. She brought printouts and highlighters and showed neighbors how to make a record that could outlast disbelief. She taught the habit of naming what happens in plain language, because paperwork, when written by those who are usually written about, can be a kind of shelter. Sometimes, very late, she would stand in the doorway of the bedroom and look at the laptop's sleeping screen, a dark square that once pulsed with an accusation. She would imagine a city where the benefit of the doubt was not an inheritance but a policy, where investigations began with curiosity rather than confirmation bias, where being tired and human did not place you closer to guilt. She would picture the mornings when her patients thanked her for being there at 4 a.m., for noticing the pain they thought no one would see, and she would accept that this, too, was a way to repair the world, a stitch at a time, a chart correctly filled, a hand steady over a pulse that fluttered and steadied and fluttered again. She did not end the story with triumph. She ended it with a vigilance that felt like tenderness. The hallway bulb stayed bright. The door learned a new firmness. The city kept shifting and she kept counting its truths. She learned to hold space for the grief of her own choices without letting that grief become a campsite for every injustice waiting to pitch a tent nearby. She learned to say no to the soft coercions of convenience, and to the easy lullabies of apology unearned. She learned to narrate her life without needing a chorus to echo it. And she learned to ask the question that the light had once asked her on that first morning: what do we choose to illuminate, and who do we leave in the dark? The answer, she realized, is a daily vote cast in how we look at one another, a ballot made of attention. If betrayal is the quiet theft of trust, then justice, true, practiced, ordinary, might be the daily act of giving people back the light that was always theirs.